Our ego really shows up, especially in relationships, and our neurocircuitry of our own attachment styles and patterns shows up, and that can be dysfunctional. And just what was modeled or what wasn't modeled, or trying to navigate it and just like trying to be okay. And relationship can just be so dysregulating, and so it can cause us to do things that are very unloving. And then in our pain, but that's not our ideal, of course. And this thing that we all want, because we all want to ultimately operate in these higher states of being, in these higher frequencies and currents. Hello, this is the May Be Mindful podcast, and I am your host, Hannah May. I'm a mother of 6, conscious birth instructor and educator, spiritual growth facilitator, and certified hypnotist. This podcast is about inspiring hope, expanding awareness and consciousness in order to revolutionize the way we live and experience our lives. You can expect thought-provoking episodes, each week spanning a range of topics, drawing from both my own journey of transformation and healing and working with others. I hope you find this podcast to be informative, refreshing, illuminating, and instrumental in your own soul's evolution and growth. Let's jump right in. Hello all, welcome back to my podcast. I'm Hannah May, and we're like fresh off Valentine's Day. I went off on this little tangent in my stories that I actually got a lot of feedback from a lot of people who were curious about some of the things I was talking about. And it sort of just prompted this episode. I was actually going to talk about navigating spiritual narcissism in the healing field and how to avoid it and what to look out for. So maybe that'll be next episode. I don't know. It'll come in there somewhere because it's a good one, like how to avoid the shady ass practitioners. But then I was like, no, we're gonna just like bring it up a notch, because we talked about narcissism the last episode, and we're gonna just elevate our consciousness here with love. But I was talking about St. Valentine, and I was talking about this idea of transcendent love and sacrificial love, and as a state of being that allows us to transmute our pain, to heal, and to overcome anything, even death, and overcome fear, certainly. There's so many different aspects and perspectives and different types of relationships that we can talk about. So it might be a multi-part episode, but we'll see what happens. So I was talking about St. Valentine because I think it's funny that he's the patron of love, but he was brutally beheaded. And there's this funny meme that I share sometimes where it's like he's standing at a table and there's a couple at dinner and he's got his head on a plate and he's beheaded, and he's like, "Thank you for celebrating me on this day. I was brutally martyred by the Emperor Claudius, blah, 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 the year 260, 70, whatever it is, AD. And they're horrified because they're like, whoa, that's not what we thought we were celebrating. Because love, when it comes to relationship, especially romantic love, it can get pretty warped and degraded, and it can end up digressing really into like fear-based control and attachment. And really what I want to do is I just want to read to you a bunch of shit that other people wrote and said, because they said it better than I did. But I was talking about what's his name, Valentine, in the sauna on Valentine's Day. He would perform these nuptial ceremonies in secret because at the time Christians were being heavily, heavily persecuted, especially for those first few hundred years after Christ's death. And Christ, of course, was like this pure embodiment of love, agape love, true love. This is the highest form of love, sacrificial love, which we don't really think about when we get into a relationship, like a romantic relationship. We're like, wow, how does this make me feel and what can I get? We don't think about what we're going to have to do like for love, and actually how much of the self and the ego self has to die in order to embody this kind of love. You get married and there's death of self involved in that, because it's no longer just about you and what you want and your own selfish desires. Then you really want to die some more. You have some kids, okay? And like they'll kill your ass because they're just these gorgeous little beautiful demanding beings that require they require you to spend yourself. And any parent knows this. I mean, it requires serious endurance, and there's a serious conditioning involved in parenting, and there is a high degree of love you're called to. And it doesn't always feel that great. Like, honestly, you're just like, really? I don't want to fucking wake up right now. I want to sleep my ass in. And you can't always do that. Often you can't do that. That's what I'm talking about, is like there's a sacrifice involved. And a lot of times people view love in the romantic sense as like this transactional thing and about being even, about getting what you want, right? Obviously, I talk a lot about self-care. So there's a balance with this and what is spiritually sound and having discernment and navigating through it. And ideally, you match up with a partner who has the same ideals as you do. But the fact of the matter is not everybody's going to be like, depending on where they are in their growth zone, they're not going to be in the same place all the time, right? So sometimes you're going to have to carry the burden for them. I mean, praise God that my husband has carried the burden for me when I haven't been able to fully show up in the way that I'd like to, as a mom, as a parent, whatever. And he's been like, I got this. And like, he's seen where I've fallen short, and he's carried that load for me. And there's been times where he's just not been there because he's been working or whatever, and he hasn't been able to. And I know what it feels like to have to carry that full burden, and it's an incredible gift when somebody sees that and they show up fully and they overextend themselves in a way that supports the whole. And that's really beautiful. That is love. That goes beyond like that initial lose yourself love, that high that you get, and all those chemicals and endorphins and dopamine. That stuff's great. Like, those drugs are awesome. However, that's not the thing that's going to sustain you and carry you through your relationship, because that stuff wanes and waxes, and inevitably you're going to be called to show up where you might not really feel like it sometimes. And actually, Anthony de Mello says there's this idea with love that people think love is blind. And I can't find the exact quote, damn it, and I'm not going to go searching for it right now. But he basically says, people say love is blind. It's actually not. It's the most crystal clear thing in the world. Attachment, however, is blind. He says, for love is the passport to abiding joy and peace and freedom. And that's the thing that we're wanting. That's the thing that we're seeking, right? But the access doorway, I'm unquote, is through love. And interestingly, in David Hawkins' work, when he measures and calibrates these different levels of consciousness, joy is calibrated just above love. And I'll talk about that in a second, because as it is a state of being, rather than something that we are seeking to obtain or like striving to grasp. It's a state of being that really we need to surrender into and allow to flow through us. And it's this connector, of course. But he says, for love is the passport to abiding joy and peace and freedom. There is only one thing that blocks our entry into that world, and the name of that thing is attachment. It is produced by the lusting eye that excites craving within the heart, and by the grasping hand that reaches out to hold, possess, and make one's own and refuses to let it go, right? Because it doesn't respect the autonomy of another person. And so we get very sometimes attached, and then we become overcome with fear, the fear of losing something. The moment that you're become more and more attached to something, the more fearful you become of losing it, because who are you without that? Because the more attached to something you are, the more you identify with it, and then it starts to define you essentially, and then that's your identity. So you certainly can't lose it, because who would you be without that? And then if you go down the whole path of relationship addiction, that's a very much what's at play there, and this need to self-gratify, right? And that's the opposite of true love. Like true love doesn't really consider itself. It actually loses itself. And that's why in the beginning, when you first like connect with somebody and you have that spark, you do lose yourself. And that's beautiful. That's part of it, that's designed to sort of get you hooked up and connected, hopefully to the right person, and you're healed enough to be able to make those good conscious choices for yourself. And so this true love is this elevated state of being. So back to the St. Valentine thing, there many people were being martyred for their faith, right? But the interesting thing is that the blood of the martyrs always purified. Why did it always purify? Why was it such a powerful change agent? And why did it make the faith stronger that Christ instituted? Because these people, what they were witnessing was transcendent love that overcame and conquered fear. So they lost all their fear in the face of death, like brutal deaths, like barbaric deaths, where they were being like fed to lions and all kinds of like horrific tortures, okay, that were being inflicted upon these people who were simply following what they believed. And they were really lit up. And so when they were marching to their death, sometimes they were marching illuminated and transformed, like their whole countenance would change. And it's actually, even in the Bible, there's a story about Saint Stephen and his martyrdom. And it talks about his face becoming that of a face of the angel, you know, before he died. So it's like he left his body before he died. I would be surprised if he even felt his stoning. Honestly, they stoned him to death. And people converted as a result of that. And interestingly, St. Paul was there at that death before his conversion, and he shortly after was knocked off his horse, right? And so who knows what the moment was that really shifted him, that led to that profound conversion where he was temporarily blinded. But anyways, what would happen in these public arenas is people that witnessed this would convert on the spot. So there would be thousands and hundreds of conversions that were happening sometimes instantaneously. And this went on and on and on. And to me, this explains why the faith flourished and persevered and grew up and was not able to be extinguished, even in the face of that heavy, heavy, multiple centuries of persecution. Do you see? And so this is agape love, right? It gives without condition. It's not self-gratifying. Jesus embodied this, obviously. He died for mankind. He bore the sins of humanity. He was blameless. He was sinless. And he was completely innocent. This is this higher transcendent spiritual love. But how that translates into our relationships, I think, is really interesting because it gives without condition. And so in relationship, like anytime you put conditions on your love, whether you do it intentionally or not, what does that make it? That makes it the opposite of love. That makes it conditional love. That's not unconditional anymore. And I think sometimes we do it unknowingly, but the reason that we're doing it is because it's become a self-gratifying experience for us, and we are not living in the vibration and the frequency of love if we're doing that, because what that would look like instead is radical acceptance, and radical acceptance of letting somebody go and not possessing them or not trying to control or manage them. That's a pretty challenging thing to do. That is definitely something to be a perpetual student of, I think. And that's just as far as relationship goes. There's a priest said to me when I was first together, and I actually heard, I think there was like some celebrity or somebody said it. I heard them say it on social media recently, and it reminded me, this priest said to my husband and I when we were first together, before we were married, and he said, marriage is not about showing up 50-50. It's really about showing up 100%. And like I was saying before, you know, you never know like where you're going to have to carry for somebody else. And thank God when they can carry that extra for you. And obviously everything that Christ said around love is worth paying attention to because it's pretty spelled out. But one thing he says, he asks us to put love on. He instructs us to wear love, like put it on, wear it like a cloak, like a garment. So think about that. It's like you clothe yourself in it. I think that's a really beautiful image. And so you let that cover you. And, you know, in the face of fear, there's also a saying in 12-step that says fear and faith can't live in the same room. You get to choose. What do you want to give yourself over to? Yeah, one requires a little more effort sometimes. And the other one, fear, seems to actually put forth a lot of effort to drive your ass out of the faith and the love room. It really is a force. Fear is a force that is not as powerful as love, but it's a little bit intimidating and it's controlling and it's bossy. It pushes you around and it dictates choices. But with love, we are given the option of stepping into power rather than being pushed. It can be easier to feel pushed sometimes than have to move towards something that feels uncomfortable and take that action and that effort to step in to that place. So we are asked to meet love, I believe. We're asked to step into it. And I actually want to read something that St. John of the Cross said from one of my favorite meditation books. It's called Divine Intimacy, and it's based off of the teachings of St. John of the Cross, who was a mystic, and St. Teresa of Avila, who's also a mystic. So St. John of the Cross says that 1 degree of love is sufficient for a soul to be in its center, which is God. But the more degrees of love it has, the deeper it goes into its center, and hence the strongest love is the most unitive love. So the deeper we go into this center, that is God, the more we sound God's depth. And it's like you can perpetually enter in. Like I mean, isn't that crazy? That's what I'm saying. It's not a substance, it's not a location, it's not a destination, it's a state of being. It's on another dimension, on another plane that you're essentially stepping into. God has endless depth that we can sound, right? So mystically speaking, this is a very deep concept, really. If you start meditating on this or thinking about it, and we don't take much time to do that because we stay in our conscious mind a lot of the time. And speaking of our conscious mind, I need to read to you about the jump that David Hawkins talks about in his calibrations and measurements of states of consciousness from the level of acceptance. Well, yeah, it goes acceptance and then it goes reason. And then after reason is love. And interestingly, after love is joy. Love calibrates at 500. Joy starts to calibrate at 540. And that's because it says as love becomes more and more unconditional, it begins to be experienced as inner joy. This is not the sudden joy of a pleasurable turn of events. That's not joy. Like a pleasurable turn of events can create or spark joy, but that's like entertainment, right? That's excitement. That's not the same thing. And it's circumstantial. But he's saying this is not the same thing as that. It's a constant accompaniment to all activities, which means good or perceptively bad. Joy arises from within each moment of existence rather than from any external source. 540 is also the level of healing and of spiritually based self-healing groups, which I think is also really interesting. And he says level 540 and up is the domain of saints, spiritual healers, and advanced spiritual students. Characteristic of this energy field is the capacity for enormous patience and the persistence of a positive attitude in the face of prolonged adversity, right? So it's like being able to tap into that essence and that state of being despite maybe what you're being challenged with and what meets the eye, and being able to see the silver lining, so to speak. So in case you guys aren't familiar with this, I've talked about it a little bit before, but he created this map of consciousness that he measured with thousands of calibrations, hundreds of thousands. And this may or may not resonate for you. For me, it really does. And it really aligns and it makes a lot of sense. It starts at the very bottom in the lower levels with shame. It talks about apathy and grief and shame and control and desire. And then it goes up to courage, is like that point in which you make a major transition into a more functional member of society when you step into courage, because that allows you to overcome those lower states. And then he talks about, hold on, I'm going to get there. And then after courage, neutrality, which is like a beautiful place to be, right? Neutral, not really affected. Energy level 310 is willingness. Then you have acceptance, which is also a radical place of awareness and transformation that can take place. And then he talks about reason, and he just explains a little bit how emotionalism is transcended here, because reason is capable of handling large, complex amounts of data and making rapid, correct decisions, understanding the intricacies of relationship. This is the level of science, medicine, and generally increased capability for conceptualizing and comprehension. Education and knowledge are sought as capital. So the shortcomings, however, of this level are failure to clearly distinguish the difference between symbols and what they represent, and the confusion between objective and subjective worlds that limits the understanding as casualty. At this level, it is easy to lose sight of the forest for the trees and become infatuated with concepts and theories, ending up in intellectualism and missing essential points, right? So living in the conscious mind. And it's interesting because I think about people who are purely scientific in their thought process, and they can't transcend that state of reason and their intellect. But if we just live in our intellect and in our mind, we can really get lost in that. And sometimes there's no relief in that, because we have this hunger to more deeply understand. That understanding can happen experientially through faith, through love, rather than just trying to wrap our minds around it. And then he says, reason itself paradoxically is the major block to reaching higher levels of consciousness. Transcending this level is relatively uncommon by only 4% of the world's population, which I don't know what the numbers are on this now, because this book was written a minute ago, but that's actually kind of wild to me. And I would like to think it's higher than that. But then on the other hand, based on the state of the nation and some of the stuff we see, it wouldn't surprise me either. But I tend to err on the side of optimism and think that it has to be higher, because I really believe, especially in the last 4 years, we've gone through such powerful transition and escalated change and growth. It just seems to be a little bit more extreme now. It says, love takes no position and thus is global, rising above the separation of positionality. It is then possible to be one with another, right? Despite what other people believe. If we're not attached or needing other people to believe something different, then we can just see it objectively and accept. But that's not where we're at right now, clearly. Some people are, but then it's like, what do you have to do to get there? I mean, I would think in order to get to that place, you'd have to really have some self-care, like radical self-care, radical self-love, and remove the things that you're ingesting that are causing you to feel divided, that are feeding like negative feeling states, that are feeding lower states of consciousness. Whatever your focus is what you're going to be embodying ultimately. So like the focus has to shift. So if you're only focused on one news station or outlet, then that might not go so well for you. And it might be worth becoming either a little more well-rounded or taking a break altogether. You know, I know for me, just personally, because I'm really sensitive, I was just talking about this with my husband about how he's more objective, and he functions really well in the level of reason, actually. And so he's able to view things very objectively. I'm very sensitive to information, and I can easily embody and become a very subjective. So for me, I choose to keep a lot of that out of my diet. So I don't watch the news. I'm on a need to know basis with a lot of stuff. And if certain things are supposed to pop onto my radar, then I'll do a little research on them. But I'm very careful and mindful about what I consume. That's just me. That's just based on my own makeup and what I know works for me. And my husband's a totally different animal, and we're all different, you know. So I think it's important to consider. And if you're feeling in these lower states, then it's like, well, where is your focus? What are you focusing on? So it says here, you know, around the level of love, I'm just going to read a little bit to you more. It says, love as depicted in the mass media is not what this level implies. On the contrary, what the world generally refers to as love is an intense emotionality combining physical attraction, possessiveness, control, addiction, eroticism, and novelty. It is usually evanescent and fluctuating, waxing and waning with varying conditions. When frustrated, this emotion often reveals an underlying anger and dependency that it has masked. That love can turn to hate is a common concept, but what is being spoken about rather than love is an addictive sentimentality and attachment. Hate stems from pride, not love. There probably was never actual love in such a relationship, right? Because that relationship is obviously self-centered if that's happening. And the 500 level is characterized by the development of a love that is unconditional, unchanging, and permanent. It does not fluctuate because its source within the person who loves does not depend on external conditions. So it's interesting because when you think about, like, when you go after a person, when you pursue a person, and then the loss if you don't obtain that relationship or that person, or if it doesn't work out, or if they leave, or whatever, like all the things that can happen in a relationship, it's like we've lost that love, but that's only if we're going after their source of love. Why would we need to go outside of our own source of love? We already have it. It's like St. John says about going inward, right? That's our source of love. That's where it's at. That's the divine wellspring within, that if we don't seek to cultivate and fill up there, then we're going to feel empty. And then, yeah, we might go chasing somebody else's source of love. Like, how does that work? It doesn't ever, it's not an equation that ends in our favor, really, ever. It ends with us feeling more empty. And eventually we hit a wall where it's like, okay, we need to either do something dramatic or just we need to go inward. It's funny, a post-it just fell off my whiteboard that says, that's around relationship addiction. And he also says this is the level of true happiness. Only 0.4% ever reach the level of unconditional love at 540. Golly. I mean, I actually do believe that. I really do, because I don't think a lot of people actually ever experience unconditional love. So, all right, guys, we're going to have to wrap this up because I'm getting tired. But one thing that I want to talk about, another chat, is love in the dark night of the soul and love in eternity. So as it relates to beyond this life, like how we can utilize it as a superpower and a weapon, essentially, to fight for, to have victory with in this life, but as it serves in the next life, which I think is actually a really exciting topic. At least it is for me, because I think it's important to cultivate excitement around what is beyond our human understanding of our short experience here on this earth. Does that make sense? Not to get morbid, but it's actually very exciting, because I really believe that when we die in this world, we are really waking up to eternity, which is a really incredible thing. So we'll dive into that maybe next time. I love you guys. Thanks for sticking with me. Open to your feedback. And as always, grateful for all your love and your support. Let me know what you think. Leave me a review. Mwah! Thank you for tuning in to the May Be Mindful podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us grow and improve. For more information, resources, and exclusive content, visit our website at maybemindful.com, or go ahead and follow us over on Instagram at maybemindful. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please give me a follow, screenshot the episode, and go ahead and tag me until next week when I bring you another thought-provoking and inspiring topic. Until then,